istu siia minu kõrval.
Hannes, you are... Where do we go?
Hello.
China's here?
He will start, isn't it?
That doesn't matter where you sit. Yes.
I don't mind.
Please, take a seat there, and Taimar, you will sit here.
Kas nad osad räägivad prantsuse keeles ka?
Ei ole veel juhtunud. Üks rääk itaalia keeles eile korraks.
Hybrid world, kas ma ikkagi hybrid sõjast tohin rääkida või on see...
Jah. Well, for those who are still outside, please do come in for our final session of this IPC conference, session 6, which is, I think, as relevant a topic that we're going to focus on now as have been all the topics in yesterday and even the day before yesterday, and it's called or titled Practical Aspects of the Hybrid World, including the cybersphere and strategic communication. A very wide range of topics that can be covered under this title, of course. And in today's world, of course, increasingly important issues as our daily lives are so intertwined with being online, using electronic services, electronic devices, internet. This, of course, makes our lives much more convenient in a way, but also there are challenges when it comes to the vulnerabilities that arise from this dependency, increasing dependency. And this next session that is beginning now is oriented to practical examples to widen the discussion about the hybrid sphere and the fight against disinformation in strategic communication. And I'm very pleased to have two excellent panelists here on the stage with me and with Marco this morning. First, let me introduce Giles PORTMAN. He has been the head of the East StratCom task force in the European External Action Service in Brussels since September 2015. Before this, he worked for 12 years on EU-Turkey relations, including as chair of the EU Enlargement Working Group and as deputy head of a mission at the British Embassy in Ankara and advisor to the EU High Representative. Even further down the line, he's been a communications advisor and speechwriter to a former UK Minister for Europe. And the second panelist today is Mr. Taimar PETERKOP, who is right now serving as the Director General of the Information Systems Authority here in Estonia, where he is responsible for coordinating Estonia's national cybersecurity and developing Estonia's e-government platform. The Information Systems Authority is responsible for coordinating national cyber security, developing public IT solutions, including Estonia's e-government infrastructure, and administering IT-related public funds. And as people who follow Estonian politics or news know, in these last days he's been incredibly busy sorting out some serious issues. Now, the requests for questions or speeches can be registered now. The floor is open. And I will give you more generous time as we did yesterday for your questions or comments. 1 minute, 30 seconds to start off with. And let's try to wrap up this session by 12:45, 1:45, meaning we have an hour and some minutes, because the lunch will be ready and prepared a little bit sooner. Many of you will have to leave, take your flights home. So, without further ado, please start now. And for the initial comments, could I, Giles, ask you to introduce the topic as you see it, and then Taimar, and then we will open the floor for the questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. So two topics to cover, cybersphere and strategic communication. I'll focus exclusively on the second of those, and also in particular on the work of my team. I've been asked to give a presentation, so I hope it's going to magically appear on the screen. Yes, it did. So let me just run through the work of the team quickly for those of you who don't know about us, and try to explain what we do and some of the findings that we have come across since we were set up a little over 2 years ago. And just to recall, or to stress for those of you who don't know about the team, we were set up by the European Council, a mandate given by the heads of state and government of the EU to the High Representative to set up a team with a very specific and very unique mandate to challenge Russia's ongoing disinformation campaigns. Why did the European Council reach that decision? There was a perception in the years leading up to that decision that the Russian government and military were clearly developing information confrontation as part of the toolkit. We saw on the record public statements legitimizing the use of false data and destabilizing propaganda. We saw a new Russian military doctrine which specifically looked at the use of information and disinformation as an extension of military capacity. So we saw a very clear statement of intent. And in terms of what we saw practically from the Russian government, we saw very generous funding for strategic communications. We saw the development and spread of key outlets such as Russia Today and Sputnik, which look like other international media, but are in fact very different. The EU was concerned enough to place Mr. Kiselyov, a leading Russian journalist, on its sanctions list. And we saw the development of a whole new sphere of disinformation in the form of troll factories, bots, cyborgs, and the like. So my team was set up to respond to this challenge, originally set up as 7 communications and Russian language experts, drawn mainly from the member states. 2 years on, we're 14 people, so we've doubled in size in the course of 2 years. I'll come on to exactly what we do in terms of countering and responding to disinformation, but I think it's important to contextualize our work and say that that's only a part of what we do, because we decided at the start that, in fact, the most effective way to respond to disinformation about Europe and about European policies is to improve our own communication of those policies. And we perceived a clear underperformance in terms of EU strategic communications to the East. And a lot of what we've done, about 2/3 of our work in terms of resource, staff time, is devoted to trying and improving the EU's communications towards its East, and to assisting our delegations to become more strategic in their communications, to become more professional, to identify their target audiences better, to hone their messages better, to try to understand what people care about in the region, and to try and communicate in a way that resonates with them. So some examples there. In terms of top-middle, explaining how the EU is supporting judicial and police reform in Ukraine. To the right, we're supporting a year-long anti-corruption campaign in Armenia. To the left, communication around visa liberalization for Georgia. At the bottom, running a region-wide Erasmus campaign to explain to young people the benefits of an Erasmus program and how they go about becoming an Erasmus graduate. And bottom left, also engaging with new audiences. Bottom left is a picture of the Georgian clergy, senior Georgian clergy who visited us in Brussels. The most respected institution in Georgia, but one that has been traditionally skeptical and concerned that the EU is challenging traditional values in Georgia. So we engaged with them, explained what the EU acquis does and doesn't cover, and addressed some misconceptions. And we've seen the Georgian clergy changing its rhetoric about the EU and what the EU is trying to do in Georgia as a result. Overall, over the last year, we've seen some really good results in Moldova, Armenia, Georgia, we've seen something like a 15% rise in people who know about EU projects in their country and think they're a good thing. But there's a long way to go as well. And perhaps the event dominating our thoughts in the coming weeks is the Eastern Partnership Summit in Brussels in November. We've taken over completely the communication of the summit and of the policy and of the various side events leading up to the summit and beyond. The Eastern Partnership is something that is not well understood, and what we're trying to do is simplify it, change its visual identity, increase its resonance, pick it apart, and try to explain to people in the countries of the region what it means for them. The second area where I think it's really important that we engage is on supporting quality journalism and freedom of the press in the region. Now, I think in the EU, 5 out of the top 10 countries in the world for press freedom are EU member states, so we have a pretty good situation. It's not so good to our east. What we're doing with the Commission is trying to engage independent journalists and find out how we can support them better. Next week in Kiev, we have a conference for, I think, over 300 independent journalists from the region to hear from them what are their challenges in terms of lack of funding, intimidation, lack of training, lack of networks, access to information. And the idea is that their recommendations then feed into the summit itself on the Eastern Partnership in November. And our own small contribution is to try to engage more with Russian language journalists. So for the first time now, we're running in Brussels a Russian language webpage for the EU. It's not bespoke or new information. It's simply providing to Russian speakers the same information that is accessible to citizens of the EU in official EU languages. And we're supporting that by trying to reach out to Russian language journalists across the spectrum. Doesn't matter their background or their political affiliation, but simply saying if you want more information about the EU and its policies, we can provide that service to you. But then we come back to disinformation. And our key role in trying to monitor and understand better the threat of disinformation, Russian and pro-Kremlin, is our weekly disinformation review that we set up coming up for 2 years ago, where we seek to try and collate on a weekly basis what we see as the main messages coming out each week, which are either factually incorrect or deliberately manipulative and distorted, and in line with the key narratives that we're seeing coming out of the Kremlin. And we try to share information as widely as possible about what we see. So we produce a weekly disinformation review. We share that on social media, reaching about 2 million people a month via our own social media channels, but also crucially giving constant background briefings to journalists to encourage them to look into the subject more closely and do their own research and write their own stories. And as of next week, we'll have a newly vamped, newly relaunched website where we seek not only to present this information so that anyone can search it and use it for their own research, but also to present all our own analysis of the challenge of disinformation, and also try to keep track of the main themes, the main countries targeted, so that in time, we would hope we'll be able to begin to forecast where the next disinformation challenges are going to come from. A couple of comments on the website. Firstly, it's very important to stress that we focus on the message, not the messenger. So we're not analyzing specific European outlets and trying to blacklist them or saying don't look at them. On the contrary, we entirely respect freedom of expression, but we're looking at the message and saying this is a message which is either false or deliberately manipulative and distorting and in line with Kremlin narratives and policies. So we look at the message, not the messenger. And we also say very clearly that there is not necessarily a link between the outlet and the Kremlin. We're simply saying that this is a message that we observe to be the same or remarkably similar to a Kremlin-inspired message. And I think it's also important to say that on our website, we say very clearly, if we've made a mistake, contact us, and we will look into it, and if we're wrong, we'll rectify it. We've discovered well over 3,000 examples of disinformation since we've been doing this. I think we've been questioned 5 times, and we're confident that on each of those 5 occasions we were correct. Let me look at maybe 4 themes that come through again and again. Firstly is a very clear targeting of Europe. Roughly half of all the disinformation that we see is about Europe, about European politicians, policies, values, elections. We saw a clear targeting of Monsieur Macron in the run-up to the French election. Angela Merkel has, I think, been the #1 individual targeted as long as we've been doing this. Top right there is a story from the last week saying that she's endorsing underage marriage. In fact, she's visiting a Syrian refugee camp. Her foreign minister was criticized this week for supposedly greeting Ukrainians with a Nazi slogan, which wasn't a Nazi slogan. Bottom left was a threatening video produced in the run-up to the Dutch referendum on the DCFTA, which was quite convincingly traced back to the troll factory in St. Petersburg. So we see an intent to interfere with and influence the democratic and political process in Europe. Second theme that comes through very clearly is a denigration of us, of Europe, of the West, of the EU, of the member states, of our values, our populations, the way we live. Constant claims that the European Union is Nazi Third Reich by another name. Claim bottom left that the European Union has peddled drugs to Moldova. Top right that we're constantly attacking Russia. Middle right that the European Union and EU member states and political leaders themselves are complicit in the very terror attacks that we suffered, that our politicians knew the people who were perpetrating them, and that our policies in the region are a fraud, and that we will let down the countries that we are partnering with in the Eastern Partnership. And also a constant denigration of the West's values. Stories this week, constantly stories that the EU is legalizing paedophilia, but stories this week too that in Copenhagen the first brothel for zoophiles has opened. The third theme is that Europe is collapsing, partly because of our immorality and because of this chaos in our own values and policies. Top left is a very popular image which has appeared in 3 member states and the US, claiming that there are no-go zones, Sharia no-go zones in member states, 23 in Sweden alone apparently. It's just a British guy who stuck some stickers on lampposts. Top right, stories that European supermarkets are running out of food, that there are queues for food in Denmark, that Danish people are so poor that they wash their children in puddles. You're probably familiar with the Lisa case. There's been a constant messaging about the dangers of going to Europe. Claims that thousands of people are raped on the streets of Brussels each year, for example. And some fakes. Bottom left, a Sputnik story which claimed that there were mass demonstrations in Helsinki about immigration and anti-immigration demonstrations. In fact, as you can see, it's a gathering of people celebrating an ice hockey win over Russia, but it was presented as something completely different. And then the fourth theme is messaging which excuses Russian policy or tries to confuse about Russian policy. One theme that has come back repeatedly over the last 3 years is about the tragic shooting down and loss of life of MH17. And just in the last couple of weeks, we saw the story come back again, that an air traffic controller, a Spanish air traffic controller called Carlos, working for Ukrainian air traffic control, spotted a Ukrainian jet fighter honing in on MH17 just before it was shot down, and this received broad coverage in Europe. There was no Carlos. Carlos doesn't exist. He never has worked for Ukrainian air traffic control. It's a myth, but it comes back again and again. Constant messaging on Ukraine, of course, that there are no Russian troops in Ukraine, or that if Russia has intervened in Ukraine, it's to prevent a genocide perpetrated by a Nazi government in Kiev. On the right, we did an analysis of RIA Novosti news reports after the attack on a humanitarian convoy in Aleppo. And we found that over the course of a few days, multiple entirely contradictory and fabricated stories were produced. And the role was clearly not to inform, but to confuse and present a smokescreen over the truth. And at the end of the day, bottom middle, any criticism of Russia can eventually just be labeled as Russophobia. So in terms of our approach, as well as the disinformation review and trying to get a handle on the scale of this problem and of the key messages and the key audiences, we also try to react and correct and inform in very simple ways. So here, for example, our infographic just explaining what the EU's sanctions policy is, or top left, a simple graphic responding to very strong disinformation about the scale of NATO's build-up towards the eastern borders of the EU, and just actually correcting in numerical terms the claims and the truth. We've produced videos on how you identify a troll and what to do about trolling, and a video just this week looking at RT and Sputnik and explaining how they're not like the BBC or Reuters or whoever. Those are our contact details. Last comment, we can't do this alone and shouldn't be doing this alone. So I have a team of 14, 3 people work full-time on disinformation. It was the member states of the EU at the highest level who gave us the mandate to do this, so it's also a responsibility for member states to decide how they see the problem in their countries and what they want to do about it. It's also a responsibility for the Commission. As I said, about 50% of the disinformation we see is about Europe. It's about our internal processes. So we see now the Commission taking this issue more seriously and focusing on it more. And the Parliament, the European Parliament, has always been interested in the subject. And there is now a pilot project proposed in the Budget Committee to give more resource to trying to get a better handle on the scale of the problem, on the impact of disinformation, and on the best responses to it, which would be enormously helpful for our work. So I hope it goes through. So thank you. I'll stop there.
Well, Giles, thank you very much. And Taimar, now into the cyber stuff. The floor is yours.
Thank you. As you know, best cybersecurity is provided by not using technology, so I don't have any slides. Cyber is perfect domain for hybrid warfare. It's because almost all aspects of our daily lives, either our personal lives, how our societies function, how our governments function, depend on using information technology these days. And while we have developed these technologies, we haven't taken security into consideration very seriously. But the opponents, or the other side, are constantly working on how to use the gaps or this technology against us. Just to illustrate that, let's look at the most important cyber or mostly covered cyber attacks that we've seen in past year. Of course, the first is the hacking of elections. But when you look into the US elections, what was actually hacked? It was John Podesta's, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager's Gmail account. It was Democratic National Committee's systems, and it was state-level voting, voter registries, etc., etc. So very different, completely very different information systems that were hacked. WannaCry, NotPetya were large campaigns that encrypted data of government agencies, private sector agencies. Didn't affect Estonia, but as we all read from the news, in UK, the medical institutions had to be closed because of those attacks. Bangladeshi bank, $1 billion was attempted to steal from the Central Bank of Bangladesh by using cyber means and some other aspects. And it is reported that behind that attack was North Korea, and with the motivation to earn money. Internet of Things was used to attack, to just overwhelm our servers, and Ukraine power grid. Both in 2015, 16 Christmas, different parts of it was taken down. Very different attack vectors, very different aspects of our lives, but it demonstrates how much we depend on IT, and different aspects can be attacked. Who is behind those attacks? Well, it can be governments, organized crimes. Usually, since most of our data and money is virtual these days, the organized crime has moved to that world as well. And also the governments are using more and more cybersphere to project power. And you cannot really tell a difference whether it is, every time you cannot tell a difference whether it's organized crime or governments who are behind those attacks. Like I mentioned, the Bangladeshi Central Bank, a motivation of a government that is usually espionage or project power can be just to earn money as well. In some countries, it's very difficult to distinguish between where the security services end and the organized crime starts. When the historical links, for instance, in Russia between the organized crime and security services make it very difficult to tell a difference who is attacking. And these days you can buy in cyber attacks as a service as well. You don't need your own capability. You can hire a team from the market. Second thing that makes it perfect battleground is attribution. If you want to hide your tracks, you can hide. Technically, it's very difficult to attribute certain attacks to a country or a non-state actor. So you need other aspects, political motivations, human intelligence, etc., etc. And again, the good example and the good study is what the Americans published about the hacking of US elections. It's not only IT that was used, but very broad set of tools in order to attribute this attack to Russia. And the third aspect that makes it perfect battle domain is that the rules are not there yet. The development of IT has been so fast that the governments, the international organizations haven't kept pace in regulating it. And you can read about it in Tallinn manual, both version 1 and version 2 of the rules and regulations about the cyberspace. But what we see again is some countries that are using offensively cyber attacks, that how they are using this lack of norms, and how the US elections hacking of US elections is attributed to Russians. That can you imagine that the Russians would send their agents and breaking into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters? But in cyberspace, they do that, and they even don't cover the tracks that well. Elections, since you are all politicians here, elections are a good example to demonstrate how it works and how we have to defend. As I already talked about hacking US elections, and almost every country in Europe where we are having elections this year is talking about the Russian threat of election hacking. But when we talk about elections and the information systems that are involved, there are so many layers. It starts with John Podesta's private email, Gmail account. It starts with Democratic National Committee. It's a party like any other party in Europe. It's the newspapers, it's every information system that is involved in the political process, voter registries, voting counting systems, local governments, central governments. In Estonian case, since we are the only country in Europe who has internet-based voting in general elections, it's also special information systems for voting. So you need to defend all those information systems in order to defend the most important political process that is elections. So governments cannot do that alone. It's and that's a good example how you need to defend your society, your country in cyberspace. It's a team sport. Everybody plays along. It's or total defense or whole of society approach. It's the organizations, the parties, it's individuals, you, me, John Podesta, who needs to use proper cyber hygiene. It's, and of course, governments. And it's very important the role of the politicians. To have political leadership is vital. Estonia has managed to come so far being a digital society and defending that digital society in cyberspace, very much thanks to the political leadership. And while this technology is developing so fast, we need the leadership as well to guide us how to use that technology in order to provide better services and protect the countries in cyberspace. And Europe is, during our presidency of the Council, it's I think the most important aspects of cybersecurity in Europe is of course the European Union cybersecurity strategy, that I think we will see the new version of that or publishing of it the next week. And I think we all have a chance to participate in debating that. And I think the timing of the strategy is very important, because it's what we've seen, the attacks using cyberspace against our societies are so acute that we need a new political direction what to do. We need political leadership to push through what is in that strategy. And what I've seen and heard, although it hasn't been published yet, is that it is quite ambitious. So I'm very happy that in the coming weeks we all have a chance to participate in delivering it. So thank you.
Both speakers, thank you very much. And now I think Marko will be the first one to pass the floor for the questions.
Sure, and as Hannes proposed, let's limit the question with 1 minute and 30 seconds. And the first in a row is Mr. Michael Gahler from European Parliament. Please.
Yes, thank you very much, Giles Portland and Taimar PETERKOP, for your contributions, especially to Giles to have you here. It's an opportunity to thank you for what you and your team are producing, and I have to confess every Thursday morning when the email comes, I'm anxious to open it and to see what we've got there. My question is, on the one side, what is the systematic, where are you working along? Do you decide on certain topics that should be raised at a certain point, or is it simply that you go through and see what comes, or is there some preferences that you go through one or other special topics, and how do you make this choice? Do you accept suggestions from outside that come to you, that you focus more on that? That is the one question. And the other one, and I think that would be important when it is about having more money for you. We are discussing in the Parliament that it would be very valuable to have this thing also in other languages. I mean, we have in some countries, including my own in Germany, fertile ground for this Russian propaganda. I think it's also the case in France, it's also the case in Italy, and probably anybody from its specific countries will see it where it is. But the question, could you not also hire some interpretation capacities? And if it were only to translate specific things that are directed to the given country. That, I think, would be very valuable to broaden your knowledge base.
Thank you. Please, Giles.
So, thank you. So on the first question, how do we choose? No, we don't have any sort of predetermined ideas about what we're going to focus on. We wait to see what comes in each week. And what we find over the 2 years of doing this is that we get a lot of similar stuff coming in. And that's one of the key findings of our work, if you like, that there's nothing remarkably new. It's repeating the same disinformation themes that I showed in my presentation. Now, sometimes we worry that by saying the same thing every week, we lose an audience, and that we ought to focus on some of the quirky stuff as well. And we do that sometimes in some of our features and our blogs, but at the same time, we must be careful that we don't give a distorted view and claim that one quirky story has actually had a massive impact. So we may have a fun story every week as well, which may cover that ground. But no, we're driven by what we receive. And then in terms of languages, absolutely, we'd love to communicate in more languages. At the moment, our website is primarily English only. We also have Russian and German at the moment. We have managed to have Czech, Slovak, and Ukrainian media translate some of our products for their own use. The way we've reached a pan-European audience thus far is by talking to journalists and by saying, use our information and then write about this in your own language. But absolutely, if funding were there to communicate in more languages, it's one of the things we'd most like to do.
Shall we proceed now to the second question, which will be by the EP, Tunne Kelam. Please, Tunne.
Thank you very much. I think this debate reminds me the old wisdom that battles are being won or lost first in the minds of participants. That is about mindset. And I think here we are relatively unprepared because Russian propaganda knows very well how to use weaknesses in our mindset, confusions, hesitations, the relativity. Nobody has understanding that there will be clear truth. Truth have become relative. And the old Soviet saying is that you need so much truth as to keep a big lie together. But my question about StratCom is, you have done wonderful work, but what would be your ideal expectations? How many staff? Are you now on the firm financial basis? And do we need such task force centers in the member states also? You mentioned contacts that member states are being represented there, but still. And the second question, actually to our colleagues, what can we do to advance independent Russian information from Russia? For example, Novaya Gazeta. I don't see it available in Tallinn airport. There are other Russian editions. Russian films. Yesterday, Kara-Murza, our colleague, showed his film about Boris Nemtsov. Very powerful film. I think we should try to advance showing this independent information in our member states too. Thank you.
Thank you. So as I said, we've doubled as a team since we began, and I think that sends that clearly shows that what we're doing is valued and that there's more to do. And I think you partly answered the question by your second question about whether we look for more StratCom cells in member states as well. I absolutely think that is a large part of the answer. So we see that in some member states, probably most obviously the Czech Republic, which set up a team of 10 in its Ministry of Interior. So different member states have different solutions in different parts of government. But when we're asked for the real granular detail of a disinformation website in a country in the EU and who's behind it and how's it funded and who's the editor, we can't answer that kind of detail. And it's for member states to decide whether they think this is a threat and a problem and whether it needs to be looked into or not. So I absolutely think that the right model is the team that we have in Brussels, but that the key is to replicate this with more resource in member states as well.
Okay, I see now that the topic is interesting, and I'll take two of you in combination. So first, Mr. Eugen Freund from European Parliament, please.
Thank you very much. I was the shadow rapporteur for, as you probably know, for the recent Strategic Communications Act that we had in the European Parliament. And my big reservation on this was, as you also probably know, but the rest of the group here may not, was that we included ISIS in this. And I always argued that if you elevate ISIS to the same level as Russia, you are getting into deep trouble, because we are doing something that we never wanted to do, and that is to elevate ISIS to a sort of state actor. And so the question is, the reason why you didn't mention ISIS here has to do with the fact that we are very far in the north and far away from Syria and very close to another actor, or what was the reason? And or are you basically supporting what my argument was initially? And secondly, the question that always baffled me was, how many people do actually watch Russia Today or Sputnik? Have we ever found out, did we ever do sort of a polling where we realize, because we all know, I mean, we all know CNN, but hardly anybody watches it unless there is the hurricane or there is something, you know, of really great relevance. Thank you.
Thank you, and the next question comes from Iceland, Mrs. Austa Gudrun Helgadóttir, please.
Thank you very much. So we are here talking about cybersecurity, or information security to be more exact, and Estonia has proved itself to be leading in the development of digital governance and understands the implication and the challenges thereof. According to what Minister Mikse said yesterday, Estonia wants to be leading in freedom of expression, and even he goes so far to actually say that freedom of information should be the fifth freedom. Okay, this is all fine and dandy. I don't disagree with that. However, like happens constantly in the policy area of cybersecurity, the left hand does not know what the right is doing. This week, the Estonian Council Presidency proposed amendments of the Copyright Directive that are simply incompatible with the notion of freedom of expression and cybersecurity. Those amendments are suggesting upload filters kept by private companies, which simply means privatized surveillance and censorship by multinational companies, such as Google or Facebook, all in name of copyright protection. It seems like every single time we talk about this cyber threat, we have to start at the very beginning when talking to policymakers. Even High Representative Mogherini claimed that she did not have the technical competency to answer a very basic question yesterday on surveillance and cybersecurity. So I'm going to direct my questions to Mr. PETERKOP, the Director General of the Information System Authority of Estonia and other representative of Estonia. How do upload filters, which basically means privatized mass surveillance, that means that the data of European internet users would have to be handed over to these companies for filtering. How is this compatible with the very notion of cybersecurity?
Thank you. Giles and Taimar, please.
I think the first question was for me. Thank you. So a very simple answer to why I didn't cover ISIS is because my team doesn't. So our mandate is to look at Russian disinformation. There is now a new team in the External Action Service Strategic Communications Division, which is our Task Force South, and that looks at the challenge of misinformation from extremists, but also how we can improve our own communication to the Arab world. And we work very closely with them, but I agree they are very different challenges. That's why I didn't cover ISIS. In terms of the impact, I think this is, you know, a very important question, and if we had more resource to look into the impact, I think that's something that needs to be examined more. Now, I hear often that RT's viewership is actually quite low, so how strong is its impact? What we see from analysing disinformation for a couple of years is that it's not just a case of people watching RT or reading Sputnik directly. It's not just a case of Russian government outlets and passing their message to other outlets. It's also a case of traffic in the other direction, misinformation being picked up by those outlets and magnified. So what we see is that the size of an outlet doesn't necessarily have a direct relevance to its impact. If we look at the Lisa case in Germany, what was initially a story produced in a very obscure online news outlet became big enough to bring 12,000 people demonstrating into the streets. So it's about the network that can draw on this information and multiply it rather than just the initial outlet that carries the news. And there we see that the impact can be much higher than we realize, and the audience can be quickly a mass one.
Taimar.
The second question, I'm sorry, I have to be the left hand that doesn't know what the right hand is doing. This discussion is new to me. The cybersecurity section of Estonia has not been involved in that discussion, so I'm sorry I won't be able to give you an answer without studying the matter in more depth.
Okay, we take the next two questions, and Barbi Pilvre, please.
Thank you. My question is about Kremlin anti-European narratives and populist parties' messages. What we notice is that Kremlin anti-European narratives coincide often with populist parties' messages, especially about European values, bringing along moral decline, just like equal rights, human rights, LGBT rights. And the most simple conclusion would be that Kremlin is behind those populist movements and parties, financing them. But this is probably not always true. Probably these messages just coincide with Kremlin propaganda. How should we tackle this phenomenon? EU anti-propaganda web pages probably will not help us out. So that's a question for you, probably.
And I will now take the Slovenian representative, Mr. Jan Mahnic.
Thank you, Chair. Talking about hybrid warfare and one of its most effective aspects, which is propaganda war and fake news, I think the situation is improving, but we are still far behind Mr. Putin, which reflects the public opinion. If we ask our citizens about their feelings towards Russia on the other side, or NATO on one side, or NATO on the other side. So my question is, fighting against this Russian propaganda war, can we expect that artificial intelligence will be one of the important part of the defense in the future against fake news in this hybrid war defense? And my second question is, do we need a control over the whole information environment? Thank you.
Please.
I think the first question was probably for me again. In terms of political party affiliation or funding, it's something we don't look at all. We look purely at strategic communication, so I can't comment on that. On the point you made that probably some of these messages that we see in European discourse are coincidentally the same. I take that point, and I think it's correct, which is why what we say in doing our disinformation review is that we're not trying to restrict freedom of expression or blacklist people or say those views are not acceptable. We're trying to say that you may have reached that view entirely independently, or you may have reached that view because you've received manipulative or distorted information. If it's the former, okay, that's your right. If it's the latter, here's some information that you may also like to look at to consider whether you've reached a correct answer or not. And in terms of the long-term solution, I think that's why I wanted to talk you through the three objectives of what we do, because the long-term solution is not just identifying disinformation on an EU website. And we will never reach a mass audience through doing that. It is also engaging with media and trying to support quality, independent, professional, investigative journalism throughout our continent. And it is also acknowledging that we have a role in the European Union to make our own communication better if we're to persuade citizens across the continent that what we're doing is worthwhile.
Taimar, do you want to reflect?
The second question.
Yes.
I think the question itself is a very good description of how Russia and the West approach cyberspace differently. For Russia, at least from all the documents that are available publicly and the statements made by their senior leaders, is that their approach is through information sphere or informatization. They look at offensive and defensive cyber, how it can be used to affect the functioning of society, and how Russia should be defended against outside influence. For us, it's a technical issue, more or less. We are now, in last few years, we are just about to discover, and like we're talking here, is that cyber can be used for affecting our societies as well through social media, etc., etc. So the technical aspect of your question is can artificial intelligence be used? I would guess yes. My technical people tell me that the future cyber wars are fought between artificial intelligence. My answer to them is that so that means that we don't need any IT people, but for bureaucrats like me, there is always room. But so yes, to take down botnets, etc., artificial intelligence can be used.
Thank you, dear friends. Now I see that to the end of our session, we have 15 minutes and 6 colleagues would like to take floor. I ask you to fill a question within 1 minute, and I'll take 3 of you in first lot and Hannes 3 in the last one. So first, Mr. Vytautas Pakas, please, from Lithuania.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. My questions for Mr. Portman. In presentation about strategic communication, you were speaking about supporting independent journalists. Could you please share examples how member states or politicians should support independent journalists and investigative journalism? Thank you.
Thank you. And next to neighbor of Lithuania and Estonia, Mrs. Lolita Tšigane, please.
Thank you, Chair. I believe that organizers made an excellent decision today morning to have a session on Russia, because it helped to figure out how Russia is thinking. And I would like to ask a question to Mr. Portman. Now, having worked with Russian propaganda for several years, do you feel you've figured out the Russian mindset and you know how they are thinking and why they are doing certain things in the information space? And another question that I would like to ask to Mr. PETERKOP, you mentioned the fact that Estonia is probably the only country that is fully running internet elections. And for a long time we were admiring you, but now we are happy we never switched to internet elections, because obviously scare of cyber attack is probably as bad as the actual cyber attack. How do you feel about internet elections nowadays? Are you planning probably at some point to go back to paper? Thank you.
Thank you, Lolita. And the last but not least from UK, Mr. Thomas Tagandet.
Good morning. Giles, if I may, are we winning?
Thank you.
That's an excellent short question.
Okay. Panelists, please.
Okay, thank you. How do we support independent, investigative, quality journalism? The one-word answer is money, actually. what we see in the region is a lot of journalists who are very well trained, who have probably been trained multiple times by different member states. They don't need training. What they need is access to information, networks, and financial security to plan ahead beyond the end of the year they're currently operating in. So what we need is a active donor community. Now, we in StratCom have no money as donors to do that thing. The Commission does, member states do, and we are seeing some good initiatives. I think the media conference next week is really important, but we also see, for example, a Baltic Media Center of Excellence, and we see in the Czech Republic a news exchange bringing together Russian-speaking journalists from various countries to work together on producing quality news. So I think compared to where we were a couple of years ago, there are some encouraging signs now. Do we understand the Russian mindset? I mean, I have some real Russian experts in my team who have lived and worked in the country for years and who are very Russophile, actually. I think there is expertise in the team that really understands Russia. I think that we now have a volume of, as I said, over 3,000 examples of disinformation, so we understand what the thinking is and what the themes are that come back again and again. But I think that point of mindset is also really important if we look to the future and think about a situation where one day the EU will have a better relationship with Russia. My concern at the moment is that we have a whole generation of people being brought up in Russia thinking that the EU is evil and out to get them, and a whole generation of people in the EU distrusting Russia. And those are the mindsets that need to change, and actually disinformation is damaging the prospects of reconciliation, which is another reason why we're concerned by it. And then finally, are we winning? Well, I'm optimistic, because I think if you compare the level of the conversation to 2 years ago when we started, when people didn't really understand the issue, didn't talk about it so much. There was plenty of skepticism about the establishment of StratCom. 2 years further on, I see a massive international conversation about the challenge of misinformation, and we see more and more member states wanting to send resource and experts to the team and supporting it and seeing its value. So, yeah, I think we're moving in the right direction.
Thank you. Taimar, please.
Voting. No, we are not thinking of cancelling internet-based voting. There is no point of finding the development of technology. The new technologies are coming. The younger generations are using it. They are expecting the services that the governments are providing to be based on these new devices. And as long as you can guarantee that the elections over the internet are as secure as votings on paper, you can go ahead of it with them. This is our main principle. Using the new technologies, they provide a lot of advantages, especially when getting the younger generation to get involved in political process. People are moving around more and more and more. Estonia is a small country. We don't have embassies in all over the world. I think it was 116 countries in past elections where Estonians voted from over the internet. But the challenge is huge. It's the most important political process. The security issues are a bit different than with other services because of the secrecy of the vote. You cannot, after the elections, check who voted for whom and then decide whether the act was attributable to that person or not. But as far as we are sure that this technology that we're using is sure, and we are investing a lot into the security of our system, the architecture of our system, we are going ahead with it. And again, think about it. to break the system, the encryption that it uses, takes tens or hundreds of millions of dollars and years, and many, many years to break encryption. But to hack John Podesta's email account, it's much more easier, and Hillary Clinton lost the election.
Well, last three questions. Thank you, Taimar. Ruta Miliute from Lithuania, please, and be very brief, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Russian other state and non-state actors has been actively spreading misleading information about Lithuanians' security and trying to generate mistrust and discredit the alliance. So we understand very well what you were talking about in your presentation. StratCom has been doing a great job, but NATO strategic communication has not been concentrated yet. So my question is, do you think it would be useful to cooperate and to reinforce each other in the future to fight the misleading information?
Thank you. Next one up, Paula Pisco from Portugal.
Thank you, Chairman. I have three questions on this discussion. The first one is Russia the only worry in the field of disinformation? Which other countries or movements are having the same practices? The second question is, in the relation between EU or NATO or other institutions with Russia, this question is present in the talks. And the third question is, how efficient is the European action against the Russian disinformation? Thank you.
And the last question of this conference, as the floor is now closed for questions, is by Keit Pentus-Rosimannus from Estonia, please.
Aitäh. Thank you. My question goes to Mr. PORTMAN. First, how closely do you cooperate with private sector when it comes to very rapid and malicious distribution of disinformation? I know that Facebook, for example, is doing quite great job in removing those substances from the sites. And second, our Eastern Partnership countries have asked assistance when it comes to fighting the spread of disinformation. Is your task force cooperating and also giving assistance to Ukraine, for example, who is fighting not only in fields but also in hybrid fields? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now, also be please brief in your final answers.
Right. So I'll take the first and the third together because they were about cooperation with others. In terms of cooperation with NATO, we do cooperate closely with NATO headquarters and with the Centre of Excellence. And they do very different things from us. They do far more detailed analysis and research. And what we try to do is make use of that research and give a new audience to it. And we also work closely with the spokesperson service in Brussels. In terms of the private sector, I think we could work more. We do work with Facebook, Google to try and understand, for example, the appearance of bots or cyber attacks. And the Commission is considering a closer dialogue with the industry about the challenges of fake information. So I think there's room for more, but we do a bit. And how to assist member states? Well, I think it's two-way. We need help from member states, but we're also, of course, the whole point of us being at the centre is to spot the linkages and say to member states who have a challenge, we've seen this one before, and this is what we can tell you from when it appeared before. So that's part of our role. And then the second question was, well, first of all, are there other actors other than Russia involved in the disinformation sphere? I go back to our mandate, which is very clear. We are only given a mandate to look at challenging and combating Russian disinformation. And we just look at Russian and pro-Kremlin narratives. How efficient are we? I think that that's for others to judge. But given that we're a relatively small team without a dedicated budget, I think that it's a small but relatively high-impact response to a very well-funded disinformation campaign.
Now, thank you so much for our panelists. A round of applause for the very interesting discussion. And now it is to my great regret that I have to say the final words of this Interparliamentary conference to wrap up. I cannot begin to express how thankful we are, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of our team, to all the participants of this and fantastic discussions and debates that we have had here over the course of this two and a half days. And of course, my sincere gratitude goes to the supporting team. At least from my point of view, they did a fantastic job. Everything ran very smoothly. Thank you. And of course, I'm grateful to all the speakers that took their time, very high-profile people that we have seen on this stage over the course of these days. As you know, all the presidencies, they have their own little signature style of organizing the conference. I've heard many compliments to this regard, the way we did it. I've also heard some criticism. So every presidency will, of course, decide the format by themselves. This was the one a bit innovative, a bit more relaxed, a bit more focusing on discussions and debates than the some that we have seen before. Co-chairman statement, as we promised, is available now on the tables outside. As you know, we are not doing the non-binding conclusions here at this conference. And the summary of all the discussions will be sent to you within a week. So all of you who are interested, you can see the summaries